We didn't attack Putin. We leave it to tribunal.
In Washington, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken cast doubt on the Kremlin's allegations.
These are decisions for Ukraine. I've seen the reports. I can't in any way validate them. We simply don't know. Second, I would take anything coming out of the Kremlin with a very large shaker of salt. So let's see. We'll see what the facts are. And it's really hard to comment or speculate on this without really knowing what the facts are.
Moscow has threatened to retaliate against Ukraine, making residents of Kyiv worried for their safety.
They might try attacking strategic objects where decisions are made in Kiev. They might shell us with missiles again. We need to remain in safety and take care of ourselves and our loved ones.
For now, Putin remains safe. Moscow announced that he will take part in a scheduled World War II Victory Day parade on Red Square next week.
Well, for more, I'm joined now by Stephen Blank. He's Senior Fellow for Russia at the American Foreign Policy Council. Mr. Blank, it's good to have you with us on the program tonight. How likely do you think it is that Ukraine is behind this apparent attack on the Kremlin?
I find it quite inconceivable that Ukraine would do this. As Zelensky said, they don't have enough weapons and they wouldn't waste it on a target, because most of us know that Putin spends very little time at the Kremlin, and certainly not in the middle of the night. So I don't think that it's at all true. I would not put it past the Russians to launch what has been called a false flag operation. What escapes me, though, is what pretext they need, because they are destroying Ukraine even as we speak. I think this is an attempt to generate public support at home, maybe abroad, but I don't know what they could threaten to do to Ukraine that they haven't done already, except maybe nuclear weapons, and I don't think that's particularly likely. So I don't see where Ukraine gains anything by doing this.
And let's just say that the Russian people buy the line coming from the Kremlin that this was an attack. I mean, what does that tell us then about the defensive shield around the Kremlin and around President Putin?
Well, it doesn't tell us anything. All you saw on the TV was a flash, which could have been caused by a Russian drone, which they then shot down. It doesn't tell you anything. Mm-hmm. So you can't make a judgment from that. And Moscow's track record validates what Joseph Conrad called Russian officials' sublime contempt for the truth. Mm-hmm. So there's no way to prove that Ukraine did this. It makes no sense. The Kremlin is not a worthwhile military target for the reasons I already said. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't strike me as plausible that Ukraine would attack it.
U.S. Reactions, they've been somewhat circumspect. Antony Blinken says it's up to Ukraine to decide how it defends itself. But if this had been a Ukrainian attempt to assassinate President Putin, certainly the White House and the Pentagon, they would have been informed, wouldn't they?
I assume they would have been, but I've talked to U.S. government officials earlier today. They have no knowledge of what actually took place, and they're not buying the Russian story as a result. There is no evidence out there that can prove that Ukraine was behind this. And given the Russians' track record, I wouldn't run off and believe this claim either. Moreover, I mean, they're not in any position to complain about attacks on Putin. They tried to kill Zelensky at the beginning of the war. Mm-hmm. So, no, that's their modus operandi, not Ukraine's.
Let me ask you about what we're hearing from Ukraine. Why do you think President Zelensky and his government are so careful about taking ownership of any attacks on Russian territory or even in Crimea?
Well, I think it would be a public relations disaster if they attacked Moscow. They have sent cruise missile strikes at Russian military targets in Crimea and oil refineries or gas refineries, oil refineries in Belgorod, which is not far from the border. But they, in general, are very careful when they strike at a Russian target. And I don't think that they would do something this escalatory at this point in time. It just doesn't make sense.
There have already been calls in Moscow from the former president Dmitry Medvedev and from the Speaker of the Duma for direct retaliation against Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. What do you make of these calls?
Well, Medvedev and the Speaker of the Parliament are what the Chinese used to call the running dogs of Putin. I mean, Medvedev's specialty is making outlandish, brutal threats against Ukraine, which are actually not particularly credible, just to prove that he's a real tough guy and in the running to support Putin and maybe become his successor. I don't put any great store by that.
Stephen Blank with the American Foreign Policy Council. Mr. Blank, we appreciate your time and your valuable analysis tonight. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Media freedom is supposed to be a cornerstone of democracy by holding the powerful to account and keeping voters informed. But on this World Press Freedom Day, a new poll shows that many Americans are doubtful that the media is acting as a force for good. Nearly 3/4 of adults surveyed blame the media for increasing political divisions in the United States. Now, the poll was carried out by the Associated Press and the Nork Center for Public Affairs and the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. It also found that more Americans think that the media is hurting American democracy than protecting it. My next guest tonight is Frank Sesno. Frank is an Emmy Award-winning journalist. He's now Director of Strategic Initiatives at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs. And I have to say, when I was way back in the day when I was a news writer at CNN at the Washington Bureau, Frank was the bureau chief there. Frank, it's good to see you again. There's a lot to talk about. A lot of it's good, some of it bad. I want to start, though, with this new poll, which finds about 4 in 10 Americans saying that the press is doing more to hurt American democracy. Only 2 out of 10 say that the press is doing more to protect democracy. I mean, this is a real crisis of trust, isn't it?
Yes. First of all, it's good to see you again, and thank you for having me here. I think this is an important conversation. This is a really very serious problem. It's been in existence for some time. It's gotten worse, and it's fed on itself. So the more there is distrust in media, the more media actually heads for the corners of the ring where all the mud wrestling takes place, becomes more partisan, which then drives further distrust because people, the general public, says the media are not providing facts. They are leaning into the argument. They are adding to the shouting. They are increasingly partisan. And we have seen that. And it's been made worse since the Donald Trump era, when the president of the United States piled on and said the media, and then journalism actually, is the enemy of the people. And again, this has compounded problems that have been around for quite some time. So there's no easy way out of this. And it's a problem of epidemic proportions now, because it really is affecting the broader question of confidence in American institutions and a sense of what is actually factual, what is real, and what is not.
We're going to come back to that point about what is real and factual in just a moment. I'd like for you to maybe cast a glaze over across the Atlantic to us here in Europe. Public trust in established public broadcasters here in Europe, it remains, rather good, rather high, but there's a chorus of critics growing, especially against the BBC and against Germany's ARD and CDF networks. I mean, what does this look like from where you are sitting on the other side of the Atlantic?
What does the situation in Europe look like, or how does it translate over?
Yeah, I mean, what does it look like through American eyes?
Yeah, to these American eyes, it looks like sort of more of the same. We live in a time, and partly it's because of social media, partly because it's a time of immense polarization, as we have seen in so many places, in Europe as well, to include the United Kingdom and France and Germany as well, where the right wing has been ascendant. And it's not just sort of mainstream conservatives, but it's right-wing conspiracy theorists, people who otherize, people who demonize, and that is one of the big differences. There are global trends behind this. The sort of march of illiberal democracy, as we have talked about, kind of has this as one of its component parts. And part of that is to undermine and raise questions about, suspicions about the journalism in the news media, to raise questions about the actual kind of core information that people are getting, to spread doubt, to sow discord. And so that's what it looks like to me, that what we're seeing happen in Europe is not dissimilar to what we've seen elsewhere. And in some cases, it led the way in Europe, in certain countries, Hungary, Poland, elsewhere, where illiberal governments have used this as a standard kind of tool in the toolbox. And it works, unfortunately. It works because it does raise questions. It does undermine trust, not just in the media, but in other institutions.
I have to ask you about what was a huge case in the United States, Dominion versus Fox News. I'll just remind our viewers, Dominion sued Fox for airing false stories claiming that Dominion's voting machines were susceptible to hacking and that they had flipped votes in the 2020 presidential election in favor of Biden against Trump. Fox has agreed to pay, $787 million in an out-of-court settlement. Frank, you were an expert journalism witness for Dominion, and as I understand it, you would have testified this week if the case had gone to trial. I'm wondering, what would you have said?
What I would have said is that Fox News completely abandoned journalistic standards. And I've spent the last 8 months reading the depositions, studying the material, and obviously the trial didn't take place because of the settlement. But it's very relevant to the conversation that you and I are having here. Because what Fox did was to try to retain its audience, and it ended up pandering to its audience. Its audience attacked it for providing some of the factual information that they didn't like. To start with, when Joe Biden, during election night, won the state of Arizona, Fox was the first to call that, and the Fox audience piled on, criticized Fox fiercely, and Fox feared a loss of ratings. And following that was a series of several weeks of continuing to put on these kind of false claims about Dominion voting and fraud in the American elections generally. What this really does is it's kind of it's sort of a spotlight onto where journalism and media have gone terribly wrong. What I would have said is that the journalistic standards, seek truth, vet your sources, find credible people to speak up, provide context, correct errors. None of these things were done. And increasingly, we're seeing that media companies, some of them anyway, not all, there's still tremendous journalism that's taking place out there. But in being so desperate for ratings and eyeballs and clicks, in being so desperate for this in a hyper-competitive world, there are some very bad practices that have been adopted that are not consistent with what journalism should be. And that feeds the mis and disinformation universe, and it feeds the distrust because it undermines the factual basis that we need. And that's what I saw in the Fox case, and that's very much a part of the kind of thing that you and I are talking here about trust in the media in this country and elsewhere.
You know, the New York Times today published the redacted text message that reportedly led Fox to part ways with its star anchor Tucker Carlson. I mean, Carlson in this text wrote about seeing a group of Trump supporters attacking an Antifa activist, and he wrote, we've just got a little bit of the quote here, it was 3 against 1 at least. Jumping a guy like this is dishonorable, obviously. It's not how white men fight. Yet suddenly I found myself rooting for the mob against the man, hoping that they would hit him harder, kill him. I really wanted them to hurt the kid. I could taste it. Then something deep in my brain, an alarm went off. This isn't good for me. I'm becoming something I don't want to be. Now, Frank, this text was redacted. It's now in the public domain. Are you able to talk about this, or is it off limits?
I can talk about what's in the public domain. I can't talk about what is not and what has been redacted. But I did not see this particular exhibit. Did not come across my desk as I was reviewing things. But what we have seen and what is public in some of Tucker Carlson's communications internally, texts, emails, things that have been released through the pretrial motions and various other things as this case went through the courts, is a very harsh, very judgmental, very crude, very profane series of communications about colleagues, about Trump. He actually called Trump a demonic force. He said he's a destroyer in one of the communications that has been released and that we have seen and that I can talk about. But what Tucker did and what the others did that's even more remarkable is that they repeatedly said they did not believe, they indicated skepticism and worse, about the claims of election fraud and the Dominion case specifically. And yet on the air, they played up that narrative again and again and again. They brought on guests who promoted the wildest conspiracy theories and did not challenge them, knowing full well that that was wrong. Their own in-house fact-check unit debunked these things. Still, they put them on the air. They had repeated denials from the company and other very, very clear, good sources, and they did not put that on the air. And so when we look at why the public distrusts the media so much, some of that is because of this, because an organization like Fox News has gone out of its way to make things up or to feed lies in ways that are very, very damaging.
Frank, unfortunately, we're out of time, but it was good talking with you. We certainly appreciate your valuable analysis of this, and we'll keep watching to see what happens to U.S. media moving forward. Frank says no. Thank you.
My pleasure. Good to see you.
You too. The U.S. is sending 1,500 more troops to the Mexican border ahead of an expected surge in migrants. The Biden administration says the soldiers will carry out administrative duties to free up regular Border Patrol agents to carry out patrol work. The deployment of military personnel is slated to last for 90 days. Now, COVID-19 restrictions have allowed U.S. officials to turn away tens of thousands of migrants at the border immediately. But the already record number of people crossing into the U.S. is expected to rise further when those pandemic restrictions are lifted on Thursday of next week. I want to go now to our correspondent, Carolina Chamoy in Washington. Carolina, you've been to the border. You've reported from there. Border officials, they're already reporting an uptick in migrants crossing, about 7,000 per day right now. They expect even more. What will change at the border when these coronavirus restrictions are lifted next week?
Well, the White House obviously fears that the lifting of Title 42 will create chaos at the border, Brent. But it's, of course, also a political issue, a political tool, and also many Republicans are sure that there will be chaos. But then there are the ones who say that there is already a border crisis and that this will not get worse due to the lifting of Title 42. And as you just mentioned, an average of 7,000 migrants per day have been entering the United States since this year started. I have been, as you said, many times to the border in the past months. And there are already many migrants sleeping on the streets. The shelters are already packed, and it is already an emergency situation for the border cities. Title 42 has not really stopped these migrants from crossing into the United States.
So these 1,500 extra troops that are being sent to the border, I mean, exactly what are they going to do? We're trying to imagine what's going to happen at the border if you have an influx of even more people. What do these soldiers do?
Well, the Pentagon is saying that the troops will help, especially in logistics, like, for example, filling gaps in transportation, warehouse support, narcotics detection, but also data entry. And the troops will be armed, but the Pentagon is saying this is just for self-defense and that weapons are not to be used by the troops for law enforcement. We also know that the troops will be deployed, as you mentioned, for 3 months, starting in May 10th, so just one day before Title 42 is lifted. And it's also important to mention that there are already 2,500 troops at the border doing this job. So this 1,500 are in addition to the ones who are already there.
U.S. officials, they've been talking to their counterparts in Mexico, we understand. Is there any attempt to work together to deal with this? Because no matter what the politicians say, I mean, it is a crisis at the border.
Indeed, yes. And Mexico's President López Obrador and U.S. Homeland Security Advisor met yesterday with their delegations in Mexico City. And we know that the Mexican government has agreed to receive third countries' deportees from the United States after Title 42 expires. But it is still unclear how Mexico wants to deal with it. The shelters also on the Mexican side are already packed with people. And as you might remember, there was this terrible accident of a burning shelter some weeks ago where almost 40 migrants died. So the crisis is already happening on both sides, so on the Mexican side and also on the U.S. side.
Yeah, we said border agents are saying 7,000 people per day trying to cross now. I mean, do they have any idea of the expected scale of migration that we're going to be talking about a week or two from now?
We know his aides have been trying to stop these illegal crossings in the past 2 years, but with no success. Many NGOs even criticized that the Biden administration has relied on policies that were imposed during the Trump era. So there is a fear of a huge surge of migrants crossing, but no one can really tell how many more will arrive in an area that is already packed with migrants sleeping on the street. We know that the Secretary of Homeland Security, Mr. Mayorkas, that he will be traveling to the border this week to review the operations ahead of the lifting of this title.
Well, we know you will stay on this story. Carolina Chamoy in Washington. Carolina, as always, thank you. Well, the day is almost done. The conversation, it continues online. You'll find us on Twitter, either at DW News. You can follow me on Twitter at Brent Goff TV. And remember, whatever happens between now and then, tomorrow is